We're going to have 4 stems involved. So whatever I need to stem off and process separate, I will do that for the sake of the song. And it might be things you never even heard. You know, a lot of times you don't even have the speakers necessary to listen to the low sub frequencies, you know, from 70, 80 hertz all the way into the 20 hertz, where you really can't even hear it. But those frequencies start to take up real estate between the speakers. The cool thing about our monitoring setup, the Auratones, if you're a hip-hop guy, I definitely recommend you getting some of those. If you can get it sounding decent on the low end on the Auratones, they've just worked with me so well. But in the mastering stage, once we might get a balance in the stems, we're going to bring it over to the 6328s from JBL. These are a really wide frequency response speaker. You're going to hear like distortion you won't even hear on probably 90% of the systems that you take it to. So you're paying for the monitors as well. You're also paying for the room. You're paying for the room to be listened to. But we're going to tell you what you're really paying for and what a stem master is. So the instrumental, all the instruments are being bussed to one track. The 808, on the other hand, is being bussed to its own track. So that's the second stem in this equation. And then the vocals together, the chorus and the main vocal. What stem mastering isn't. Stem mastering isn't the creative part. You know, if you're sending it for stem mastering, you say, hey, I really want an EQ delay triggered on the second verse of this. That's mixing. We're talking about mixing. So that is a little different. Stem mastering is when you like the mix to a point where you're happy with it, but you just don't like the way the song is presented, and you want to make it the cleanest, biggest, most powerful song it can be. We're using a lot of control, a lot of dynamics, and I'm going to explain to you one of the key features in our studio is over here in this rack. Something that we can't, teach. It's just you have to give the props to the designers of the equipment here. But in our stem mastering session, what has worked for us, and it works for everybody we work with, is we'll use this SSL X rack. We just recently got the EQ. We have a dynamic module coming here, so we can actually have 4 separate stems, all running through different compression techniques, all very top shelf compressors. If you're not familiar with what a compressor does, let me push play on the song here real quick and let you listen to it. So we're going to mute this, and let it go through the gear. Alright, so I just got the instrumental running through. Let's look at the bus compressor. It's running through the big speakers. Just notice how that bus compressor is grabbing? Let me put it on the little Auratones for you. Let me take off the bus. And let me take off the EQ here. Now to you, in your studio, you may think that sounds fine. But what a mastering engineer is doing on this, the way that this was when this was off, to you it's very hard to hear through it's very hard to hear in general. But if we turn this one up with this off, I don't want to blow my speakers. I'm about halfway on my volume. By the time I turn that all the way up, those speakers are going to start distorting. So all we're doing on that stem, and I know this is very, very difficult to listen to, and I apologize, but the one thing that's doing is controlling the dynamics, and it's controlling the dynamic range of the entire instrument bus. The SSL bus compressor is probably one of the best compressors you can use for what we're using it for a lot of instruments, to control the overall frequencies and the balance. Now the next thing that you weren't hearing was the 808. So we like how those instruments are sitting. Now we can turn it up 20 times the amount that we could before we hit it with that compressor and that EQ. So what we're doing is EQing out frequencies that are building up. We're making the image a lot tighter, a lot cleaner, and a lot more focused. And then once we hit that bus compressor on it, we're controlling it in a mastering way. We're not using it as a creative thing, but we are using the timing on the ratios and thresholds to make it work with the tempo of the song, so we have a smooth compression where you don't even know that that's happening. And that's what industry compression is all about. You know, the better you can compress something, in sense, the better your track is. Now, that might not make sense to a lot of people. So, now, let's mute this. Now let's put his vocals on.
In my money, been straight. Stats got me living dead weight. Me,
now,
in my money.
Now, in this case, I want you to see on the DBX, this is the 808 going through. 808s are very hard to hear on small systems, but you should be able to hear it. Let me mute the vocals. If I take that compressor off, that is compressing, I mean, almost 10 decibels. If I take that compressor off, this was the #1 problem, and it's mostly the #1 problem with every song I do hip-hop. That bass has to be controlled like that. If it isn't controlled like that, it'll be ridiculously bad on small systems. It will distort on big systems. And what that does is it takes up so much real estate in the speakers, okay, that your vocals start to be drowned to a point where you can't hear them. So on the stem, what we did is we controlled that bass, and we used the bass until it sounded good on the Auratones, and it sounded great on the JBLs. The reason for that smaller setup of Auratones, which is I know you can't really see that, and I apologize. Let's see if I can get the light on it a little more. There you go. The Auratone speaker, for hip-hop and dance and pop and rock, when you have a bass that is that huge, the goal is to control it, to make it smaller, but to perceive to be bigger, which is really crazy, by the way. So what we're doing, in a sense, is using the DBX on that stem. Alright, so listen to this, and then we'll bring in the instruments. So here comes the instrument bus here, I believe. Very even. Now let me bring in the... Very tight, punchy, focused. Bringing on the big speakers. So if you're having problems with your 808s, I highly recommend. Why do I promote my studio? Because that is an art form that took me 13 years to master, and I'm still learning on it. So, you know, what compressors do this? What compressors make that sound? What do we do? You know, there might be a time where we have a stem master, and I'm like, you know what? That bus compressor is going to do the job, or that Manley is going to do the job. The final stem here, and I want you to be able to see the needles on the Manley and how much we're hitting this vocal. The vocals were recorded very well. This was a Pro Tools HD session. Let's turn this down a little bit. But listen to these vocals, and they're on these stems. So watch how much these vocals are hitting. A little 6 to 8 dBs of gain reduction to give that hip hop. Stacks got me living dead weight. Me and my money been straight. And the other thing, so you understand, the first thing that we talked about that I instantly heard before he even said it to me was how skinny the vocals were. And a lot of producers, and this is like the thing that I correct a lot as well. This is why mastering is highly important. The first thing that I correct was because, you notice how I remember saying about the 808, we have to control that. Once we control it, what tends to happen is the vocals were either EQ'd a little bit too much in the low mids, 250 to 400 hertz range, to compensate for how much bass was really going on. So you have like a flop kind of mix where the lows are super big and the highs are really high. So what most people are going to end up doing with their stereo anyways, so when they do that with their stereo, say they got their stereo in their car set to do that, your song is going to sound horrible. The reason being is because they want to boost it, not the engineer in the studio. And a lot of engineers will listen to the way their stereo is, and they'll start to make adjustments based on what they think is on the radio, where their radio is already set where the treble's really high and the bass is really high. What an engineer, a weathered engineer understands is we're trying to even the entire frequency range. So with that all being said, what we did with the massive passive EQ and the Manley MU, very warm sounding stuff, dude, perfect for vocals, perfect for about anything, but we actually boosted 270. Now, when it comes to like poor microphones, it's a very, very, very difficult thing sometimes, because that frequency range on a bad microphone or a not so good of a microphone, it actually becomes really muffled. 470 hertz, we boosted that quite a bit, about 6 decibels, because the engineer beforehand, and it's not like he's a bad engineer, it's just he just wasn't paying attention to it, and it depends on the budget he was on and whatnot. But we had 470 hertz where I really hit that, and then around 3K I was getting a lot of energy up there that I didn't need, so I cut some of that energy to make it fit with the low end of his voice. I wanted to complement, so I'm using the EQ creatively on this bus to bring out the lower end of his voice. That's the kind of hip-hop artist he was. He's got a low-end delivery, just like a Biggie or a Young Jeezy or a Gucci Man, or it just has that sound, or a Young Jock, whatever. So what we're doing is using each stem, and we're using them creatively to make them all blend back together. So on the vocal stem was the massive and the Manley MU. On the instrumental itself was a X-Rack bus compressor and an SSL EQ, so that's the second stem. On the third stem, the DBX 160A. And then on top of this, what you get when you send a stem session, and why I say it's so important, start it at home, dude, do your thing. But it's very, very, very beneficial to take it to this next step. And that's why I promote my studio, because you cannot get this. I've been here without this equipment, and I've spent hours and hours and hours trying to make it sound like what's on the radio. But it really is true that if you use the highest end gear, and you have a person that actually has been doing this a while, it doesn't have to be me. I'm not saying it has to be me, but this is just invaluable to you. So the last thing I want to speak about that happens in this equation, which in this era of audio production, the smaller the studio is, the more people are talking about analog summing. This is an 8-channel summing module. The reason we only have 8 channels is because that's what we're doing with it. We're using it, maybe up to 4 stems. We may, over time, add another one and start doing more mixes, but we've been hired in to usually finish production for somebody, finish an album. So, with this being said, the third stem was the bass. Sometimes you'll have a guy that does a stereo bass thing, and a lot of times in hip-hop, we want that bass right up the center, man. We want the speakers. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but if it's directly center, it gives more energy from both speakers to reproduce those bass frequencies. So what we do here on the summing module, that red light pretty much just sums it to mono. What's really cool about this, though, is we can listen to the stems very easily.
Me and my money been straight. Stats got me living that. Me and my money been straight. Stats got me living dead way. Me and my money.
You can even use this to do like a dropout radio session, all analog. The thing is we're adding that analog headroom with this summing module. Like I said, this is very, very. If you're looking to do mixes, mixing is different than recording. There's studios that are just set up to record. There's studios that are set up to mix. This one is one of those. We're set up to master, really, and all the gear that we choose to buy is for mastering purposes. This is the stereo module EQ. This is the stereo bus compressor. This is a stereo Manley MU, stereo massive passive. And then we have a stereo pair of DBX 160As. All these are used where we can pick and choose, and we're going to continue to grow and do this on a budget-friendly thing. I mean, this kind of, the improvement is $150. I mean, you can contact the guy that you're listening to his song. I'll put a link to his music. He's a very cool artist. So if we step back before the video ends, you'll get to sort of hear what I hear. And I'll put it on the big speakers.
That way, me and my money been straight. Stats got me living that way. Me and my money been straight. Stats got me living that way. Me and my money been straight. Stats got me lifting dead weight, dead weight. Me and my money take chances. The way I be out in these streets are lasting. I came up in the hood and I passed them. 2 bad bitches and some magnums. Hell in the shell, throw it.
And everything's there. It started with an HD session, and his response to this was, "What did you do to that?" Like, and that's the best part about what I do. I mean, like, I get to sit back and take and just take what somebody's already done and just make it that much better. I mean, just make it where the bass is sitting well. The vocals are like 3-dimensional. I mean, you can hear the vocals perfect. The vocals aren't shrill anymore. That's what we corrected. The 808 is sitting where I know when somebody turns it up and they got some 12s in the back of their trunk, it's going to be pounded. I mean, it's going to be like a hip-hop song out there. The vocals will stay intact. The instruments are controlled just enough. Everything's working together. Where if you would have turned it out before this process, you would have noticed the shrillness in the vocals that we took care of. You would have noticed the bass. You couldn't turn your speakers up all the way like a song on the radio. And the instrumentation would have been a little bit too overwhelming for some studios. Therefore, coming for some speakers,
the way I be out in these streets, I